And we just want to remember together what our search is all about. We engage so much of our time in fulfilling our acquisitive instincts, in our search for things, in our search for friends, in our search for ideas, and even in our spiritual quest, there's a tendency to follow this same human thought of searching for intellectual concepts. So we want to take a moment now to remember that that which we seek is already within us. Jesus referred to it as the kingdom. The kingdom of God is within. That the world around us is made up of many symbols, and each symbol relates to a non-material reality. And that which the heart hungers for, that which we thirst for, that which we are impelled to reach for, is already ours. And so the psalmist says, "Be still and know that I am God." And so for a moment we want to just remember that where we are right now, we are at the very center of the allness, of the infinite resource of substance and life and wisdom and love and all good. And so we affirm and we give thanks for the truth that in this hour tonight, each of us is going to experience something of an awakening within ourselves, a new insight, a greater consciousness, a deeper, more creative faith. And that we may go forth from this place tonight, not so much seeking to set things right as to see them rightly, and to walk by faith and not by sight. And we're grateful for this. Amen. Let's think about the law of faith. I would like to reiterate again a statement that I've made each time so that we can have a clear awareness of what we're doing. That when we talk about 7 main aspects of truth, or as I've used as a subtitle, 7 laws of metaphysics, that this is not intended to be an outline of the fundamental laws of the universe. Would that we could boil it all down to a few simple propositions and say, this is what it's all about. A man once stopped off at Unity Village a number of years ago, the days when it was called Unity Farm, at least Summit, Missouri, and spent some time with Charles Fillmore. And he'd had an appointment with him, and he was on his way west, and he stopped in a sort of a stopover between trains. He came out to see Mr. Fillmore, and he said, "Mr. Fillmore, I just have 1 hour. Would you please tell me all about unity?" And Mr. Fillmore said, somewhat facetiously, but still seriously, he said, "I suggest that you come back when you have a life to give." It would be easy if we could sum it all up in just a few simple statements or a few simple lectures and say, no, this is what truth is all about. The jewel of truth has many facets, and any way we look at it, it sparkles beautifully with a tremendous radiance. So all we can say is that we're looking at this great jewel of truth from 7 different perspectives. And I think they're very significant. But I just want to make clear that this is not a matter of saying, now this is what truth is all about. Because what truth is all about is what you're all about. And the truth is a revelation that comes through you. And all that any person, such as myself, can do is to challenge you and to try to stimulate you to open out a way whence the imprisoned splendor may escape. So that's what we're about. And tonight we're going to think a little bit about the law of faith. And we emphasize the law of faith because faith is always thought of in sort of another context. Like many words in religion, faith has practically lost its meaning. That comes somewhat as a surprise to many persons, but we're thinking of it in a semantic sense. And I would say another such word, and this will shock you a little bit, is God. God has lost its meaning. Words that are used so much that they suggest automatically a certain response and a certain connotation and context and definition cease to be true communicators of consciousness. And so the word faith for most persons is totally associated with sort of the confession of faith, with religion, with ecclesiastical concepts, and usually connotes a kind of rolling of the eyes upward and sort of a piety and a feeling of religious warmth and so forth. Yes, I believe, I have faith in God. And it's almost a case was, having said that, now what else is new? Faith is so much more than that. It is almost a case that if we could perhaps do well to dispense of the word entirely and to come up with some new symbol that could expand our awareness in the usage. But perhaps we don't know another word that is quite satisfactory, so it's important that we constantly reinterpret the word, as I often suggest that we interpret the word God. For most persons, faith is a vague intangible. A person who says, well, of course I have faith in God, may mean, and probably does mean, though he's not aware of it, I want to have faith in God. I believe that having faith in God is what one should do. And I want to have it. I want to experience it. So I have faith in God. And I think that this is suggested in the time when the man came to Jesus and said, I believe, help thou mine unbelief. I believe in the sense that I believe in believing. I believe that faith is a very important requisite in getting the awareness of God, getting into a healing stream. I believe it. Intellectually, I believe it. I think it's a beautiful idea, but oh Lord, help me to erase all the doubts and the fears and all the confusions that are within me. Now that was a very honest person, you see. Faith for many persons is believing in intangibles, believing in abstractions. And perhaps the little child puts it more honestly when he says faith is believing what ain't so. It's, in other words, a matter of accepting certain things that maybe the intellect can't understand, that the eye can't see, that the hand can't clasp, and yet accepting it as being valid and real and meaningful. It's said that we need to walk by faith and not by sight, and the fact is we do just that. We think that we walk in the awareness of the senses so that we know exactly where we're going, but the fact is that walking is a very important act that is closely involved in the process of gravity. In other words, you walk through the work of gravity. You provide your own motive power and so forth, but walking is an act of perpetual falling. And you continue, you lean forward and you fall, and your other foot catches you, and it catches you, and on you go, constantly being held up and supported by and moving as a result of your experience with gravity. Do you know what gravity is? Can you see it? Can you understand it? Does anyone understand it? I don't think anyone does. There's no way to explain it. We can only explain what it does. And that relates to a lot of different experiences. So we walk by faith and not by sight in our relationship with an intangible. When we talk about having faith in God, the reason I say we're dealing here with words that have lost their meaning is, in the first place, for most of us, in terms of our early conditioning, faith in God means a particular pious attitude in relationship to what some would refer to as the man upstairs. I hear this so often. I may be sitting talking with someone who has been studying truth for a long time, and quite often out comes something that's kind of a cliche coming out of some of the tapes of the subconsciousness that says, well, I guess if the man upstairs wants it, that's the way I want to do it, you see. And I'm always a little bit shocked, basically because I kind of assume that most of us in the study of truth have followed the thought set forth by Emerson when he says, when we have broken with the God of tradition and destroyed the God of the intellect, then God fires us with his presence. And it's so important that we constantly work to shatter this old God here, because you see, when we say I have faith in God, in most cases we say I have this particular religious feeling or attitude toward God, wherever he is. God who is personalized, God who's out there. And there is this tendency to feel that if I have faith in God, then God will do things for me. It's almost a case of my faith as being a test that I have to pass. So that God, who sits there with his long white beard and with his great wise appearance, sitting on his fluffy billows of clouds, looks down and says, well, I guess Eric has proved his faith, so let's help him out. Obviously, that's a childish, naive, and simplistic thought, but in the subconsciousness of many of us, because we gained our first realizations of religion in the early years of our life, and that's, let's be honest, that's the kind of attitude that most of us were exposed to, why, it keeps coming back in that consciousness. And we must then constantly work to reshape, reinterpret, rephrase, reawaken a new sense, a new perception. So therefore, if you break with the God of tradition, in other words, this God out here, whatever it is, you put a big X across it, it's gone. I've destroyed it now. And I think only in terms of omnipresence, omnipotence, omniscience, and I always like to add omni-action, and know then that as far as my experience is concerned, God is a presence that is present not just around me, not just to someone who is beside me, but as an activity that is flowing forth as me. Now, what does it mean to have faith in God? Where is he? Who do I have faith in? Again, I refer to Teilhard de Chardin in his Divine Milieu, who says that we come to a point where there's no place to bow down and worship him, not even within ourselves. How do you worship God? If God is everywhere, and God is all things, and God is the totality of all of which I'm a part. It's important that we challenge ourselves with this. It changes the whole scope of spiritual thinking. It changes the whole process of prayer, because you don't pray to God. You pray from the realization of the allness of God, and your prayer projects that consciousness. So then what about having faith in God? This is why we need to reinterpret the process. The idea of faith in God needs to give way to the idea of a believing consciousness that expresses from the awareness of the allness of God in which I live. Not having faith in God, in a sense having faith from God, or having the faith of God, having the perception of this divine process, and then going forth in that consciousness. It's not just a play on words, it's a very, very important insight, you see, because it changes the whole scope, the whole focus of our awareness. In other words, as we were saying on Sunday, God is centered in you. Remember the statement that we use attributed to St. Augustine, which probably antedated him, the idea that God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. God is a circle whose center is everywhere and whose circumference is nowhere. And when you look at that very carefully, then you see that means then that the center of God, being everywhere, must be where you are. You are the center of God. God is centered in you. The allness has centered itself in you as an eachness. You are an expression of God. God is centered in you. Now, there's nothing you can do about this. You can't add to it. You can't take away from it. All the faith in the world isn't going to change this at all. Whether you have no faith or have the faith of a mystic, it doesn't change this. The fact that God is centered in you. That's completely changeless and eternal. But the point is, though God is centered in you, how are you centered? In other words, in your consciousness, how do you see your life? And the difference is, you must be centered in God. That means that you must give the focus of your attention to the realization of what you really are, instead of emphasizing what you're not, instead of fearing, being anxious, instead of being out in the far country thinking about all the problems of life, thinking how limited you are, how meager your assets are, and so forth, and how much there are injustices around you, and so forth, that you focus your attention on the realization of your oneness with God. And then let your thought be motivated out of that consciousness. As we said on Sunday, God is no more centered in Jesus than in you. Now, that's somewhat startling, but I like to give it in that startling context, or else we miss the idea. God is no more centered in Jesus. God is no more centered in any great mystic or teacher or great scientist or great philosopher or great religionist than you are. But Jesus was more centered in God than we are. Any person who has experienced some great expansion of consciousness or has risen head and shoulders above the crowd in his demonstration of certain processes in his life may well be more centered in God or in infinite mind than you or me. But that centering is of his own volition, of his own work, of his own discipline, you see. Now, that's very important. But God is centered in you. And that's certain. That you can be sure of. Just as sure of the fact that no matter where you go on all this world, you can't get out of gravity. You can't get out of it. There's no way. You may run from it. Like the fish trying to find water, you may spend the rest of your life running around trying to find it, but you can't find it because it's always there. And there's nothing to find in a tangible sense, nothing that is separate from this to that. You're in it. You can't get away from it. So you can't find God. You can't get away from God. You are centered in God, and that's the fundamental. That's the truth about you. And the great and wonderful thing is, when we understand this, then this is the basis of our faith. Faith in the realization that God has centered himself or itself, or if you will, herself, in me. God, the allness, infinite mind, centered in me. And that I can rest on, or I can build on. That I can be sure of. And that's the basis of my faith. Because when I know that God is centered in me, then I know that I have been imbued with all power, all potentiality. Remember, Jesus says, all authority hath been given unto me in heaven and on earth. And the old traditionalists would say, well, that just proves, you see, that God has manifested himself under a special dispensation in the consciousness and the life of Jesus. That isn't what this means at all. He's referring to the divine process which is fundamental of life, not just of himself. All authority hath been given unto me and unto you in heaven and on earth. As Jesus suggested, or the father in the parable of the prodigal son suggested to the elder brother, Son, thou art ever with me, and all that is mine is thine. The whole of the infinite process is involved in you. The kingdom of God is within you. That's what Jesus said in mind when he says this, you see. It's all in you. It's all wrapped up within you, the divine possibility. So each of us then lives constantly with this tremendous potentiality of the infinite within us. Faith doesn't change this. Faith doesn't add to it. Having faith in God does not give you any more power. Having faith in God does not endow you with any more love. Having faith in God does not give you healing. As a matter of fact, it's important to look at this and to challenge ourselves with it, that God is not a healer. And to put it in the kind of challenging context that I usually do, that invariably shocks somebody, and I like to shock people, there's no point in asking God to heal you because God can't heal you. God cannot heal you. No way. God is not a healer. God is life. And that life is centered in you. Spiritual healing is possible not because God looks with favor upon you, not because some person who has a marvelous healing consciousness can do some work for you, or pray for you, or put his hands upon you, not because of any outward method or means. Spiritual healing is possible because you are a spiritual being. And the allness of life is within you because God has centered himself in you. Now that's true all the time, whether you're sick or well. So that then it follows, as I say so often, there must be an allness even within your illness. The illness does not mean you have less life within you or less activity of health within you. Your illness simply means that the life which is centered in you and which is omnipresent as gravity is being distorted in the human experience. The scriptures say, behold, I have created man upright, but they have sought out many inventions. And the inventions are the distortions of mind and emotions. So the distortion of the healing life is in the consciousness of man, not a conscious awareness, deep in the subconscious, deep in the kind of influences that sometimes come to us subliminally and become a part of our subconscious process, almost a scar in our awareness. But they are in the consciousness of man, not in the activity of God. There's no sickness in God. And if there's no sickness in God, then there is no healing in God as a special means to overcome sickness. How can that which is whole overcome that which is less than whole? Because there is no less than whole in the whole. The same sense is referring to the idea of forgiveness. Oh, if God would just forgive me. There's no point in asking God to forgive you because God can't forgive. Because God is love. We're told in the scriptures, behold, I have loved you with an everlasting love. Everlasting, constant, changeless, eternal, nothing less than love. Totally supporting you, blessing you, enriching you, flowing through you to the extent that you accept it. That you accept it. And faith is that acceptance. So if you feel this sense of guilt and you wish and you pray that God would forgive you, then you're praying amiss, as Jesus said. Stop asking God to forgive you. Forgive yourself. Work to lift your consciousness to the level that is above and beyond the sense of self-limitation and accept that infinite love of God which is inexorable within you, changeless and eternal. Then it may seem that God has forgiven you, even as it may seem that God has healed you, when suddenly the consciousness changes and you become more receptive to accept the full healing life of God, and suddenly that which was ill appears well. Even as it seems that when you're in a dark room and you open the window or pull up the shutters, that the light comes streaming in, and it seems as if the sun has suddenly come into the room. The fact is, the sun doesn't come in and doesn't go out. The sun is. But we block it out or we let it in. And this, I think, helps us to understand something about faith. Quite often a person says, do you really believe that faith can change things? And the fact is, I can answer in several ways. If I want to be real shocking, I will say, no, faith can't change anything. There is an appearance of change, but faith does not change reality. Faith does become an acceptance so that if you open the window, certainly you change the room in the sense that where it was dark, now it's light. You haven't really changed the room at all. But you change the experience in the room. So faith appears to change things, but all it really does is lift your consciousness to that which is real, above and beyond that which is relative, that which is unreal. And suddenly you identify with and accept yourself on the level of your allness, of your wholeness. And faith is the means of that kind of identification. Every once in a while, I get a letter similar to one I had recently from a man who said, I listen to you on the radio all the time. I like what I hear. He says, I wish that I could believe what you say. I can't do it because I just don't have any faith. So I can't accept the implication of this thing that you talk about. I wish I could. He went on to say, then I really believe that my life would be tremendously better if I could do it, but I can't because I don't have any faith. Then he went on to say, of course I keep on listening anyway. Well, actually, the man who says he has no faith actually is not aware of the fact that faith is an acceptance, and the acceptance is always working. Fear is faith. Anxiety is faith. Doubt is a kind of faith. It's faith that works in many ways. You see, man is a creature that is involved in an inward-out process. We're always in this flow of the divine activity, whether we're aware of it or not. We may distort it, even as this consciousness in some strange way distorts the full healing life, and then it reflects in our body in terms of illness, so that this infinite process of substance and ideas flows into us and through us, and we distort it in terms of lack, and we develop a conviction that there is injustice in the world, which distorts the flow of divine love and justice, which is fundamental in the universal process. So that the distortion is in our own consciousness. So the man who says, I know that I'd be so much better if I could just believe it, but I can't, actually is not giving himself credit as having faith. First of all, he needs to have faith in his own faith. When he comes to understand that he has faith and begins to develop a self-appreciation in terms of his faith, and then makes that discovery which is shocking, that he's been believing all the while, but believing in the wrong things, and his belief in the wrong things has caused all sorts of shadows to take place in his life. Then suddenly he's on the verge of the great discovery. Then shall thy light break forth as the morning, and thy health shall spring forth speedily. Suddenly he realizes now that he can simply turn the direction or the focus of his consciousness, of his faith, which he thought of as doubt and fear, turn it in the direction of his own oneness with the divine flow. Nothing has really changed. He hasn't really changed. Nobody gave him faith. It didn't just come out of the heavens and touch him with a bolt out of the blue. But suddenly everything's different. It's like suddenly turning on the light. And there is a thing that I think plagues so many of us in the relativity of it all. There's a tendency to think of faith by degrees. In other words, some persons say, well, it would be wonderful if I had the kind of faith that person has. But I have just a small faith. Such great faith as that person. Wouldn't it be wonderful to have that kind of faith? There's no great or small faith. In other words, faith is an acceptance. Look at it in terms of something tangible that is an overworked illustration and a crude illustration, but one that I think we can understand. There is electric power in the circuits of your home. You can have that electric power in terms of light to light the room, heat to heat your stove or whatever, or power to work your electric shaver or coffee maker or whatever, by flicking a switch. You might say, I have a very little acceptance of electricity, or I have a great acceptance of electricity. And I say, bosh. Either you accept it or you don't. You might say, I almost have enough faith. That's like saying, I almost made the contact of electricity. I almost kept my balance. I almost made sure that my bank account wasn't overdrawn. You know, almost. Either you are or you're not. There's no in-between, you see. And this is faith. Faith is an acceptance. It doesn't make any difference the degree. There isn't any degree. It's relative, you see. Jesus said, "O ye of little faith." Now that would seem to belie what I'm saying, but you see, he's talking, I believe, not in terms of degree, but in terms of constancy. When he talks about little faith, means a mild, minor commitment to faith, which means, as Emmett Fox used to say, change your mind and keep it changed. If you want light in your room, turn on the light and leave it on. If you keep flicking it off again, and you have to go over and turn it on again, then you have little faith, little acceptance. Leave it on. Pray without ceasing. That doesn't mean to be down on your knees all the time, but it means to be aware of the need to be constantly in the flow, constantly conscious of this divine process. So you have to keep working at it. There's this idea of practice the presence of God, and it's a beautiful thought. I think one of the most lovely phrases that has ever been coined, and I assume that it was coined by Brother Lawrence, at least it would seem that that's where it came from, the medieval lay monk who developed a tremendous insight in working, scrubbing pots and pans in the kitchen of a monastery as his life work, given his life to God, spent the rest of his life scrubbing pots and pans, at first envying the brothers who were involved in the chapel and so forth, and here he was in the kitchen. That was his life work. But then he developed this tremendous awareness that right where he was, he could experience God, and his work on the menial tasks of the monastery could be a worship experience. And so this was his practice of the presence. It's a beautiful thought, to practice the presence of God. If you relate it, for instance, to the idea of practicing the piano or practicing the typewriter, whatever it is you practice, you can see it as a very valid and a very beautiful expression. However, if you think of practicing the presence of God as a technique that you can pick up and use occasionally in meditation, then you've missed it. That isn't what it's all about. It's not a technique that you can occasionally apply when you want to have a mind-blowing experience in the quiet. If you're going to learn to practice the piano, then it's not just whenever the whim strikes you, you're going to run over and run a few scales. Practice, practice, practice. And I'm not saying that in the piano sense that you practice all the time, but it means that you're committed and disciplined in the practice. In consciousness, it's even more all-inclusive. You practice the presence by practicing the awareness of your relationship to the divine flow. Occasionally, when the whim strikes you, when you're studying truth, when you're having your daily word lesson, when you're sitting with a group of friends talking about spiritual things, no. How much? How often? All the time. That's the tremendous thing about this, and it gets kind of frightening. But the point is, if life is consciousness, consciousness is the sum total of your thoughts, and consciousness is not just something that becomes a light that turns on every time you're thinking seriously or spiritually and goes off otherwise, and you say, well, that doesn't count, because I really didn't mean that. I wasn't praying then. So then we have our little King's X times when we can gossip and talk about how terrible things are in the world, and did you read that in the paper last night? Isn't that awful? And so forth. But then suddenly we say, now I'm knowing truth. The light goes on, and this is consciousness. No. Consciousness is all the time. All the time. And therefore, the practice of the presence is that disciplined effort by which we seek to keep our consciousness in the flow of the divine process, to keep our consciousness attuned to God. That's not easy. But let's don't kid ourselves that, oh yes, I practice the presence of God morning and evening, every Sunday at 11 o'clock or whatever. I mean, that's fine, that's commendable. But what about all the rest of the time? This is a very, very challenging and I think sometimes a very difficult and maybe somewhat uncomfortable kind of approach to it all. But I say, why should we kid ourselves? And I know absolutely that each of you is here tonight and involved in this kind of a quest, this kind of a study, not because you're trying to put on the badge of conventional respectability, which someone refers to as the reason people go to church, but because you really seriously want to get a greater insight into yourself, to know your oneness with the divine flow. I know that. You wouldn't be here otherwise. You're not here because somebody's going to pin a medal on you for being here. It's the end of a day, and most of you have put in a hard day, and many of you haven't even had your supper yet, and it takes a great effort, a great discipline to follow this particular experience. So there's a great deal to commend here. But because I know that you have that commitment here, maybe I can kind of take advantage of you and be a little sterner with you, you see. There's no point in kidding ourselves. We might as well face up to it and accept the fullness of the process involved. And know that the practice of the presence means practice, 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 practice. And it means also remembering, admitting to ourselves that because most of us have not yet really crossed out or broken with the God of tradition, and there is this subtle something within us that still relates to God is out there and I'm down here and I wish God would help me, but oh boy, it's tough sometimes. That much of our experience not only is not practicing the presence of God, but it's practicing the absence of God. Every time we act as if our life is separate from a divine process or plan, every time we believe that we have to reach out and up to get any kind of tangible spiritual help, anytime we become convinced that people are unjust and the world is going to the dogs, we're practicing the absence of God. And that's where our consciousness is. That's why Emmett Fox used to say, don't think about the problem, think about God. Don't think about the needs, but don't think about the challenges, the difficulties, but basically think about need in terms of a vessel to be filled, and then know, as Paul says, and my God shall supply every need of yours according to his riches. Emphasize always the relationship with the divine flow. And though your problem may cause you to think how inadequate you are, that is time to remember how great is your resource. And that's the work of faith. To remember your greatness, to remember the allness, to remember the divine flow that is within you, to remember that you are, after all, a child of God, not a son of perdition, that you have this tremendous spiritual power within you all the time, not just when you're praying, not just when you're affirming, so that your faith does not cause something to happen in God. Your faith is not pushing a button so that the great signal, the great switchboard up there lights up a light and the infinite God, the Almighty, whatever, says, here, I better do something about this. There's no sense of cause and effect in the sense that you are in some way reaching out and up to get some kind of help. Faith is an acceptance. Faith is saying yes. That's all. The work is already done. The Father knows what things you have need of him before you ask him, and it is his good pleasure to give you the kingdom. It's all done. It's the acceptance. And when we understand faith in this way, it really becomes very easy. Still not so easy that it's just nothing to it. But it is easy in the sense that it's not complicated. It's not crystallized in some problem or difficulty that we have to kind of analyze with our intellect. There's an easiness of the divine flow because it's a matter of acceptance. Now, when we think of faith in this way, there's another aspect to it which I think is beautiful. And that takes us right back to the simple awareness of faith that sometimes you almost have to look at a little child and examine his consciousness to really understand. Faith that is similar to the total, complete acceptance of a youngster and his daddy or his mommy, knowing that they'll always be there, they'll always take care of him. Faith so complete that sometimes the youngster exasperates the parent because he may run off and walk all over the place, not even look back, because he knows that loving hand will be there on his shoulder wherever he is. He has that sense of awareness. And we certainly don't want to lose this degree, this dimension, this perspective of faith, because it's so very important. And the interesting thing about it is that faith, as Paul says, faith is the substance of things hoped for, the evidence of things not seen. Faith is actually a substance. It is perhaps something that maybe the unknown factor, the psi factor that ESP researchers have dealt with, something that causes the consciousness of a person to actually project a kind of an energy. A faith-thinking person, not who's having faith in God that something will happen, but a person who is imbued with the faith of God, with the faith of this relationship of oneness, that a particular kind of energy goes forth which ESP people might call psychokinesis. And I used to see this kind of faith as a youngster and had a marvelous preconditioning to this whole awareness through the experience of my own mother, who had a kind of faith that certainly I've never seen before or since. Of course, I don't know, I guess I didn't know too much before. But here was a woman who gave much of her life teaching truth, but her whole concept of truth was not intellectual, it was not profound. It centered around two very important facets of the jewel, and that was faith, great faith, and love. Beautiful love, love that was changeless. And she believed. She believed in things like the little child says, believing in impossibilities. Many of the things that were so routine to her life and experience were impossibilities. For instance, and I quite often saw the other side of the case. One time she decided to take a trip across the country, back during the early years of the Depression. She had an old car. It was an old Nash car that had about 120,000 miles on it already. And the tires were paper thin, no tread whatever. And so, of course, at home at that time, I was the man of the house, so I was going to do the driving. And so I went to a friend who was a mechanic and had him take the motor apart, take the pan down, look at it all, and he put it back and he said, "Don't take that car any more than around the block." He says, "The bearings won't last you but a few miles." He says, "They could go anytime." So I go home, ready to tell my mother, "We can't do it. There's no way." Well, there was no way to tell her. God's hand is at the wheel. This car is God's car. We'll take us where we want to go. We went. We drove over 3,000 miles, about 3,500 miles, to Kansas City and back. That was my first time going to Unity Village years ago. And people told her, "You don't drive across the desert when it's so terribly hot in the daytime. There will be a cloud over the sun." There was a cloud. We followed a rainstorm all the way. So what I'm saying is, when we're in a believing consciousness, we project something very special, and we don't want to discount that in terms of the intellectualization of this thing. It's a very profound and very meaningful thing. When you're in a believing consciousness, you touch individuals at a certain level. There's a natural, spontaneous relating with the divine level of a person. You believe in people. And some would say, "Well, you can't believe in everybody or you get hurt." But that's not believing in them, you see. That's being foolhardy. That's saying it would be nice to believe in people, so I'm going to try. But really believing, you see, leaves all doubts and fears aside and projects a consciousness of love. It's the kind of consciousness that some of the mystics of India talk about, and it's a very real thing, saying that if you are sitting in the jungle and a lion comes toward you, if you have perfect love and no fear, the lion will come up and eat out of your hand. But if you have the slightest degree of fear, it will attack you. And of course, this is true, and most of us have experienced that. So it's a kind of projection of an awareness that God is centered in you, and it flows forth from you, actually tingling from your fingertips. And out of this consciousness comes the kind of things that makes for the simple little so-called miracles that some persons talk about and others dream about and fantasize about. Such things as the fact that when you use your substance, and all of us are working with substance in life all the time under the symbols of money. It's pretty hard to get along in life without money. But it's even harder to get along without the underlying substance, which is the reality, you see. And we get so hung up in the limitations of money that we forget that we're always imbued with this infinite flow of substance. No one can never be without substance. He may lack the faith to accept it, but faith is the acceptance of substance, and it's the acceptance of substance that can actually imbue even the seeming limitations of money with new power. So that even if you have the same income and the same bills, whereas before you didn't have enough to go around, suddenly there's plenty and to spare, without changing anything, except the faith consciousness, the faith awareness that projects this energy, that causes money to go farther, that causes relationships to be easier, that causes life to be fuller. Now this is the way faith works and the way it should work, you see. So I certainly want to add that dimension of it, because otherwise we can get so involved in intellectually trying to understand what this faith relationship is that we get it all up here in the head, and that isn't where it belongs, you see, because faith is not an intellectualization at all. What we really need to do is to break down the intellectual process. But know that the activity of God is centered in you. And as you center yourself in God, then you have a new awareness of faith. Faith then is a kind of a looking up process. Many persons, figuratively as well as literally, spend most of their lives walking with their head down, looking along the ground. And if you look along the ground, you'll see nothing but garbage and refuge and potholes, and they're everywhere. And one may defend this practice by saying, if I wasn't looking down, I'd stumble in the potholes. The fact is, collectively, in a community such as this, if there were more people looking up, figuratively, the potholes would probably disappear. If more people were looking up in our community, looking up to the awareness of an allness process that's manifesting through us, the city would begin to solve its problems. We're so hung up with the idea of looking down into situations, down into stock market returns, down into the idea of limitation, that we have a whole downward attitude about everything. But regardless of what the city does, the important thing is what you do as a person. You may recall, and this is a very figurative thing, you can call it literally or not, but I believe it's mostly figurative, that in those two great so-called miracles in the Gospels, when Jesus performed fantastic wonders before the eyes of many people, in each case it said, Jesus lifted up his eyes and gave thanks. One was when he fed the 5,000, and the other was when he was standing before the tomb of his friend Lazarus, who had been dead for 3 days. He lifted up his eyes. Now I say this is figurative, because many folks have seen this as, oh, he looked up to heaven and said, hey, don't forget now, I'm here and I'm your beloved son, so let's have some of that magic. But that isn't it at all, because that doesn't fit into the general context of the consciousness that Jesus outlines. He lifted up his eyes, meaning he looked away from the facts. The facts were there, and facts can be overwhelming. You know, it's like the engineer of aerodynamics who can give you all the facts that will conclusively prove that a bumblebee can't get off the ground. He can convince everybody except the bumblebee, and he goes right on flying, because he doesn't look at facts. He just is in the flow. So that Jesus looked away from the facts, because if there are any facts that are infallible, it's the fact that 5 loaves and 2 fish can't feed 5,000 people. Right? Well, of course, if that's what we believe. And it's a fact that if a man is dead, he's a long time dead, right? Of course, if that's the consciousness we're in. But he looked up to heaven. He looked away from all of this and gave thanks in the sense that he gave way in thanksgiving to a larger perspective. And whether you like to accept the full impact of either of the miracles or not is not all that important. The important thing is stop thinking of them as miracles. Think of it as a demonstration, a natural manifestation of divine law. The important thing is to see this symbolically as suggesting the need as you go out into your life and you look at your job, and the fact is you have a boss who's an old so-and-so, and he's proved it after years of experience. The fact is you work in an office or a shop where people are cold and unthinking and treat one another unjustly and so forth. The fact is that there are all these problems. The fact is you don't have enough money. The fact is you've got bills over your head. The fact is nobody loves you, and you can prove it by the fact that everywhere you go people turn the other way. These are all facts. Of course. You can talk about them and outline and write books to prove that you're right. You can say that the fact is you have aches and pains and you have this problem and that problem, and like the hypochondriac, you can pass away and have printed on your tombstone, "See, I told you." And all these are facts. The fact is the ache is there. The fact is the experience is there. But when you get into this law of faith, and I emphasize law, not just emotion, not just dealing with the caprice of the whim of God, but the law of faith, when you lift up your eyes, look away from the facts, look away from the appearances, and relate to the realization that God is centered in you. All that the Father hath is yours. All that the Father has. That you are hooked into a tremendous universal process of substance and life and intelligence, and there can never be absence. Only fullness, only all-sufficiency, only total love, total support. And that's the way you've been created, and all that's implied when you say sometimes so simply, "I'm a child of God." Look up from all else and accept life, accept the infinite process, and accept yourself from a higher level, a higher perspective. And then suddenly, as Jesus says, all things are possible unto you. If you believe, and that's what believing is. That's what faith is. Accepting yourself at a higher level, and all things are possible. And at any time in life, we can step up our consciousness, heighten our perception, lift up our eyes to a higher level, and tune in on the all things are possible. And accept that all things at any level that we have the faith to believe. If it's only just the all things are possible in terms of we who haven't spoken to one another for 6 months can at least smile at one another. Only that much, okay. Or if you can accept it on a higher level, we can come up and throw our arms around one another and suddenly become fast friends. All things are possible. You decide what level you accept it. But the all things possible is the divine potential that is written on your heart and imbued within you as what Jesus calls the kingdom of God in you all the time, ever present, never absent, always available. Anytime you have the will to lift up your eyes, to look away from the appearance, and to really know the truth. And faith is knowing the truth, knowing the reality, knowing the allness. It's a fantastic and yet extremely simple process. It just takes commitment and the willingness to say yes. All right, so much for the law of faith.